Okay.
It is good to have you all here today. We're on our next to the last class. The good news is these things were very simple chapters and no challenges at all in them, were there? I loved how she started chapter 10, where she puts up the unspoken rules.
Yeah.
And the first rule was, do not give feedback on my racism under any circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
And if you insist on breaking that cardinal rule, then you must follow. And there were all these things like proper tone is crucial. You must give feedback privately. As a white person, I must feel completely safe. All kinds of things that protects us, but at whose expense? And I think that's part of what this whole class is about, is how do we not accept something that's simpler or easier for us and hurt somebody else. Maybe not intentionally, but making it so that it's harder for that person, more damaging, more challenging, more dangerous for that other person. And receiving feedback is one of the best ways to do that. So I want to share her second set of rules, which she called the, what did she say about them? She said,
Guidelines on building trust.
for receiving feedback. Okay? So
Yeah.
let me just show you
There
this.
too.
How, where, and when you give me feedback is irrelevant. It's the feedback I want and need. Understanding that it is hard to give, I will take it any way I can get it. From my position of social, cultural, and institutional white power and privilege, I am perfectly safe. I can handle it. If I cannot handle it, it's on me to build racial stamina. And number two is, thank you. To just sit in that space where we receive from that other person what it is that they are critiquing us about. Now, the hard part about that is that there might be some really tough things that you might have to hear, right? Because there's a lot of history of where we haven't been good in America. There's a lot of people who have been hurt and that carry the hurt, the generational hurt that is there. How do we just receive that feedback? How do we allow our hearts to be open and not defensive? I want you to ask that question in a couple of different ways. First of all, how do you do it so that people around you can have trust in you as someone who will listen to them? And second of all, what are you going to do as you go into conversations with people and suddenly they're the ones who are expecting the first set of rules when you are talking about racism? It's a tough question because we easily get diverted. Can I show you one example? So I posted this on my Facebook page the other day. Ooh, where is it? Oh, you know what? I probably because of Wendy's question got it mixed up. So let me find it again here.
All my fault, right?
It's almost this time all your fault. Okay, so here it comes. I posted this picture. The one man holding a sign that says defund the police. The Floyd video opened my eyes, but if that means eliminating the police, count me out. And the man holding the sign says, it means a reassessment of law enforcement methods and priorities, emphasizing accountability, and goes on and on about what all defund the police can mean. Oh, why didn't you say so? Now, I posted that on purpose because the reality is that we often, in our white fragility, fight things like defund the police. And that's a regrettable term. We could have chosen a lot of other terms that are better. But in our fighting about it, because it's essentially when this started, look at the very first quote. Now, this is not my feed, but this is very similar to some of the things that I got on my feed. that hits the nail on the head. Words matter. Defunding is threatening to anyone who does not understand its definition in this context, including police. A true statement, but listen, not a helpful statement, because it diverts from the question. The black man is saying there is something wrong, and what we need to do is say, tell me about it. Instead, we fight, maybe not as badly as this man does, but do we give them a chance to be able to speak why? So I had friends of mine, people from this church, a couple from this church who said, but we shouldn't use that term. Maybe we shouldn't, but is it making it so that we're not listening? What stops your ears is essentially the question today. What makes it so you don't listen to what the person is saying? That's not a rhetorical question. What makes it harder for you to hear?
When someone's very, very angry.
Yeah, yeah. At one point, she addressed that specifically, and she said, what if that person comes at you and is very angry about it and calls you a racist? None of us wants to hear that. It's a harsh word for us to be able to take and hold without it being a weapon.
I think also when someone tries to shame you, or when someone does shame you, no one's ever changed the way they behave because they were shamed.
What else? It's really a hard question because, like I said, you have to look at it both ways. There are people who are going to look at you, and because if you have set up a trusting relationship with them, they are going to speak hard words for you to listen to. You want them to do that. You want them to be able to feel comfortable enough with you that they can speak that to you, so that you can hear the truth that they're coming from. Because if you're not able to hear that, you're in less than a full relationship to them. But second of all, you need to be able to know how to bear that same type of thing as you approach your friends and neighbors. And that they sometimes look at you and try to divert the conversation. In that conversation, my friend Mark that I told you about came and said the simple thing, yeah, let's quit. That defund the police means that I don't have to listen anymore. And he didn't quite say it that way, but that's what he meant. I won't have to listen to any of that Black Lives Matter stuff because that phrase is wrong. And my answer to him was simply this, or you could just open your ears to why it is this person is hurting. How do you help someone who throws that type of stuff in front of you and uses it to divert the conversation? Because we've gotten really good at that in America. And it protects and helps me, but it doesn't help the conversation. So 50 years after we solved racial issues, here we are, right? And 150 years after we ended slavery, here we still are. How are you going to not give in to her first set of rules, but help the second set of rules happen?
The main thing is to be able to listen without getting your ego involved.
Yeah. Or your fear.
Or fear.
Well, yeah.
Think about one of the most interesting stories over the last over the last few months that happened. A woman in a park let her dog off the leash.
Oh, yeah.
And a man started filming her and saying, please put your dog on the leash. And this woman, by all accounts, a very liberal woman, began calling the police to talk about this black man
threatening her
and the fear that she had. And she used that white women's tears, that they call it in chapter 11, to be able to point a finger of fear towards him instead of listening to.
Well, and she said, because I saw that video, that he's threatening my life, knowing full well that he could be killed because of her call.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And see, that's something that is convenient, easy, useful for us, but at what expense? At whose expense, maybe more importantly? So it's about having better conversations. It's about opening our hearts. So when you're in one of those hard conversations, you have to think about what is triggering you and what it is that's making it so that in this moment, you are less than the best listener. You are putting up defenses. You are somehow not just listening well. So think about your life and when it is that you have at some point or another been, when it was that you followed the first set of rules in whatever way, or expected someone talking to you to follow those rules because it was simpler and easier for you. When might that have been?
I think the issue of private feedback versus feedback when there are witnesses is really interesting.
It is an interesting thing.
Yeah.
But who does that protect?
Oh, well, yeah.
Yeah. And that's the thing. Yep, it sure makes me feel better, easier, but it doesn't necessarily help that other person.
No.
Right? Especially if your offense was in front of those other people, and then you're saying, but I don't want them here.
Right.
And it's not that we want to shame each other, but we should bear the brunt of the difficulty in front of other people, right? Because our words had an effect on them, and so we should be willing to let their words also have an effect. One of the most interesting things about her chapter 10 was when she went through some of the typical rules of conversation. Let me share that page with you, because I'm sure that most of you have taught these kinds of rules to each other. Oops, where is it? Here we go. Okay, so here's some of the rules that we've taught each other: to not judge, to not make assumptions, to assume good intentions, to speak your truth, to respect the other person in the conversation. And did you see how she worked against all of those and said, this isn't helpful in issues like this, especially if you as a white person are using this to save yourself, protect yourself at their expense. Why don't we judge? Because that's not humanly possible. Admit that we do judge is more important, and try to figure out how not to do that in a bad way, but just that quit judging me shuts down conversations, especially if I'm trying to protect myself. Don't make assumptions. But we can't enforce that at all. And so what we have to do is assume that assumptions are happening and talk to each other about those assumptions. Intentions, right? That protects the aggressor over the target of the behavior. Right? We can't just assume good intentions. We have to call each other and speak the reality of what's happening. We can't just speak our truth. Now, all of these things are not bad things to do, but when we use them in a way that essentially protects me over, then they become a negative for us. We should show respect to each other, but not in a way that allows me to have respect and someone else to be told to shut up. Does that make sense? Because oftentimes our spaces of respect allow those with the least power to be silenced. And sometimes we, as a white person in a conversation, have to be able to look at somebody who just said something wrong to somebody else. We have to be able to say, you were incorrect. We have to be bold in speaking that. And so it makes for less than the polite conversations we've sometimes told each other we have to have. Because those polite conversations have perpetuated an evil for hundreds of years.
You know, I never really thought about this whole issue that she raises and talks about building trust before you have the conversation.
Yeah.
And she talks about it in such a clear way that making that a requirement just negates so much of the benefit of having the conversation.
Yeah.
It just, you just never get there.
You never get there. This is how I learned it many years ago, is that we sit in a space where chaos is in front of us. And to get to real community, we have to go through the chaos. And instead, we often choose to retreat backwards to a pseudo community where we're nice to each other, but we never get deep. Yeah. And to solve these issues, you have to get deep, which means you have to walk into the mess of life, into the chaos. And until you do, you don't form a true community. And there's lots of chaos today to walk through, isn't there? Got it all over our shoes. Because we've stepped in it a lot, haven't we? And we have to figure out how to not be afraid of that. But it does. Go ahead, Judy.
I just thought it was so interesting that she discriminated the difference between what we believe and and then we call it our truth.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't do the work of recognizing that our beliefs are built on sandy soil a lot of times and not really upheld by reality.
Yeah.
But we call them our truth, and then they can't be challenged, or they're challenged at great risk.
Right. And especially if we do any kind of whatever I believe has equal power to whatever you believe. It's just not always true. Okay? In black-white relations, what I might believe as a white man about what is true in the world might have absolutely no bearing in how my black friend has experienced the very same thing I have. And I have to be willing to let his truth speak a deeper reality than what I've been able to, what I've been privileged to experience. But if I hold up my truth as equal, then it's easy for me to discount him.
Jim?
Yes.
Your friend that did not want to continue to talk to you about the Black Lives Matter movement because of the defunding of the police is the person that I think is who must be reached out to the most. And until we're able to communicate with him, nothing's going to change. We can change, I think, because we're open to change. But if you're not open to change, or as Judy said, if you have your own truths, then you're going to build walls, and you're going to say that based on the experiences that I've had, this is the way that it is. And that's been a challenge for me whenever I've been in rural situations. I think I talked to you about when I went as a kid from Baltimore to Billings, to Montana, and was told in Billings that if my friends in Billings had lived in Baltimore and there had been riots, that they would have gotten up on the rooftops and shot the niggers. And as a child, that was really upsetting for me. And I said, well, how can you say that? Do you know any black people? And they didn't. And the same thing happens when I'm talking to people in Alpine. You know, so I don't know how you deal with that, because you can't be confrontational. If you're confrontational, then they shut down. But if you're not confrontational, then they are just going to feel comfortable that what they believe is right and nothing changes. So what do we do?
So let me modify what you said a little bit. I think you can be confrontational, but you have to be confrontational in a relational aspect. You have to do that in a way where you have trust built up between you, to where they don't just run, to where it's not just a fight. And it is hard to maintain that space. With Mark, he continually goes and runs away because I'm challenging his things that he is saying. So after he didn't respond for a couple days after my response to him about defund the police, I wrote him on a private message and just said, what happened? You haven't responded. Did I offend you? Trying to invite him back into relationship, back into the conversation. You're right, that confrontation can drive people away, but you can't not be confrontational, because that keeps you in pseudo community rather than drawing us towards real community. So you have to have the relational in the midst of that confrontational.
What did your friend respond to you?
He hasn't yet. I'm waiting for him to respond still. But it has to be an ongoing conversation. And the hard part is we have neglected that conversation too much. So one of Mark's questions for me was, why is it just now that this is all coming back? Why haven't you been speaking all this stuff for the 1990s, the 2000s, the 2010s, right? And it's a fair critique. Why hasn't America had these conversations in these decades?
Well, why hasn't St. Francis? Diane and I, oftentimes with the previous pastor, talked to him about racism, and I wanted to know why he was focusing so much on the gay thing and equal rights for the alphabet people, but not for people of color. And I remember David saying to me that the people of color thing was passé, sort of, that it was done, that it wasn't what was happening now, and that we should be focusing on other issues. And that really did happen at St. Francis on a few occasions.
Yeah.
And our kids felt uncomfortable at St. Francis sometimes.
Sure. And that's not a wrong assertion or a wrong choice at the time, but we have to realize that it probably, because of choices we make, we lose other things. And we have to decide to go back and remember what it is that we've forgotten. Right? It's hard for us to do all the work there is to do, isn't it?
Yeah.
And at least part of what this moment is telling us is some of what we forgot to do in the midst of doing other important things needs to be returned to.
But I see why your friend asked you that question, because I've asked that question too. And, you know, this is not something new. White fragility, you know, I find myself, and this is probably very politically incorrect of me, but I find myself wondering why a white woman, Robin DiAngelo, is making millions of dollars off of the book White Fragility. And if it had been written by a woman of color, the same thing would have happened. I think, you know, and I'm not saying that she didn't write a good book and that she's not performing a service, but I see that happening all the time too.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
and I have two thoughts about that. First of all, one of the things she's trying to do is saying, white people in America, this is our job to fix, not Black America's job to fix. And so this is a conversation that because it's our error, it's our defenses that are there. And so we should be solving this. It should be our conversation, not just Black conversation, or not even led by Black conversation, that we should be the ones who repent of our own sins, if I can say it that way, right? That we fix the problems that are there. Yes, go ahead.
I'm just looking at the very last sentence in chapter 10, and she says, I repeat, stopping our racist patterns must be more important than working to convince others that we don't have them.
Yeah.
I think that's probably key to this whole thing, is that just as David would have said, he marched with Martin Luther King. And we as a church have been on that side of this too. But then there's another issue that comes up, and you can't, as you said, we can't fight all of these issues at once. But right now, this is the one that is in the forefront.
That's right.
And right now, it is important for us to look at ourselves and say, what is my my sin in this area? In other words, where am I at this?
Yeah.
And before I can convince anybody else, I have to first figure that out about me.
That's right. And we have to be bold in saying whatever it was that we made, whatever choice we made in the past, good or bad, what is it that this moment is calling out to us? Now, to go one step further, let me do my advertisement here. Because we are right now having a very good conversation about a book written by a white woman, I want to remind you that our next class is about a book written by a Black man, Ibram Kendi. And this is a great book because it calls us towards what we have to be, calls us beyond just the race, it calls us beyond just being not racist. We have to be anti-racist, and we have to work against it. And so remember that that's going to start September the 3rd is when that class is going to start. So I invite you to be part of that. It'll be at the same hour. So we'll have, we have next week's class, then a week off, and then that class will start, okay?
Jim, is that open to the community, the greater community beyond St.
It's
Francis?
open to anybody who wants to be there, absolutely. Okay. Yeah, because I think in this moment, one of the things we want to make sure doesn't happen is that we don't become complacent and quiet and silence the discussions that need to happen. This needs to move towards a better resolution than before. And she pointed out two of the reasons why it didn't get resolved before. I was so happy to see chapter 11 because, you know, it's called White Women's Tears, so I could blame all of you guys and not have to take on any of the responsibility for my own gender's problems, because it's all you white women that are doing it all wrong. right? And then she gets to that section about a third of the way in that starts talking about white men's fragility most commonly shows up as varying forms of dominance and intimidation. And she didn't let me off the hook. And I wanted somebody else to be to blame for a while. And what that was essentially doing is, what is it that we allow to draw us away from? What's the easier route, right? Do I try to control the conversation? Do I somehow close down? Whatever it happens to be, do I correct the racial profile of that other person? Or do I listen? There's a great movie out from 20 years ago called Rosewood. If you haven't watched it, you should watch it. Here's the basic story. It's recounting a true story by John Singleton is the director, one of the premier Black directors in America, an amazing man, died just a couple years ago. But he did this movie, Rosewood, a story that almost every single one of your Black neighbors knew, and almost none of your white neighbors knew. It's about a small.
We showed it at the church.
What?
We showed it at Sunday night at the movies quite a while ago.
Which means there's probably still a copy here at church, or I have one if you want to watch it. It's about a small town in on the west coast of the Florida Peninsula that was a Black community. Almost all the homes owned there, but around them were white communities. And one white woman cried the tears that said, so-and-so did this to me, when in reality it was a white man who did it, but used the easy point the finger at the Black man, use him as the scapegoat. And up to, by some accounts, up to 150 people were killed, and a community destroyed that has never been built again because of one white woman's tears. And a whole bunch of men that chose to believe and or assert power or whatever it is. So I don't want to blame it all on her. It's a whole lot of other dynamics. But the question is, that asks is, why do we allow that to continue to happen? Maybe we're not destroying communities, but are we listening in such a way that lives are destroyed? Or at the very least, lives are not enhanced.
I've got to tell you, when we showed that movie, it was monsoon time. And when it got to the most horrific portion of that movie, all of a sudden the thunder broke out all over the place. You know, just right at that time, and we're all going, OMG.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The hard part is that the reason why white women's tears works is because, first of all, as men, we want to protect the women in our life. Second of all, we have been too socialized to protect the white in our lives. And so when you combine both of those, it gives us a very easy way to do this work instead of the deeper work or the more immediate work that needs to be done here instead of that. Maybe she needs to be comforted, but if we divert ourselves, if, as Robin DiAngelo said, that happens and we turn all of our attention towards her, whose problem doesn't get addressed? What issue gets forgotten in the midst of that? I love how she essentially asserted, because she's often in places where she feels the sadness, the struggle, the difficulty. And she says she tries very hard not to show that in the workshops. But when she does, and people come to rally around her, she immediately says, no, that's the issue over there. Do we allow that to continue to be the issue? So in the story about the defund the police, the wording is wrong. It's absolutely right that wording needs to be different. But if that diverts from the real issue, then it's not a good conversation. That's white women's tears. That makes sense? So what diverts your attention so that you don't stay on what's most important? I love the quote that she gave by Kimberly Crenshaw. Imagine first responders at the scene of an accident, rushing to comfort the person whose car struck a pedestrian while the pedestrian lies bleeding on the street. What's most critical in that moment? It infuriates me that to this day, our leadership in our country has not sat down with Black leaders. Here we are in one of the most critical racial moments of our country, and our leadership is not sitting down with Black leaders. Why isn't that conversation happening? Why aren't we insisting that it happens?
Because the Republican Party is a racist institution that has, built their power on racial resentment.
Yeah.
And he has no desire to make it any different.
Exactly. That's what keeps them in power. Plutocrats that are backed by an outraged white majority.
So what are we going to do to change that dynamic, besides obviously an election in a couple
We're
of
going to vote.
Well, the problem now is that the Postmaster General is removing the letter sorting machines from post offices.
So let's not go down.
And there's all kinds of things that we have to be very vigilant about to make it so that it does not perpetuate systems that essentially allow silence to happen. Silence is not a friend of this conversation.
Mm-mm.
We have to speak. You know why things began to change in the 1960s in racial issues? The single biggest reason why it changed?
Selma?
It was happening at Selma, but it wasn't because of Selma. It's because of how
I
Selma
think it was
happened.
the riots.
It's because of TV cameras
TV
showing
watching.
Selma
Showing.
and showing the riots and taking this out of darkness and out of silence and into public eye.
Mm-hmm. And that's what happened with George Floyd.
That's right. That's what happened with George Floyd, is we all saw the horrendous nature of that in such a way that even my friend that I complain about all the time, Dean, couldn't deny that that was a horrendous thing. And we have to force that conversation to continue to be there as much as it hurts us. And we can't allow our hurt to divert from the conversation or allow people that are trying to lessen the hurt to speak about defunding the police instead of actually hearing why that's what's happening there. Do you see what it is? That's the ongoing struggle. You're going to have that struggle in your own soul because your soul wants comfort, and you're definitely going to have that difficulty as you try to talk to the people around you. And it will be much simpler to not have those conversations with those people, won't it?
And I think you have to be careful about the Republican Democratic narrative. Unfortunately, we have Joe Biden with his most recent remarks that he's made about how the Hispanic community or the Latinx community is more diverse than the Black community. And making statements like that is not helping him. You know, it's like saying Black people can't vote for Trump. That was just, I mentioned that last week. I know that I have trouble with Biden. Kamala Harris wouldn't have been my first pick for vice president either, but at least she's a person of color, even if she likes the police. But I don't know. The Republicans are going to talk about the things that Biden's saying, and they're going to say, oh, he said this, he did that. You know, he used the N-word in 1985, all the rest of the stuff that they're saying. So be careful.
Sure, because all of that is a way to be able to avoid difficulty, challenge, hard roads. And here's the bottom line. This is a hard road. And there's no way to make it anything other than the hard road that it is. And we have to force ourselves and our neighbors to walk this hard road. Our country needs to walk this hard road. And there's no simple way to do it. I wish there was, don't you? But it's been 400 years in the making. And even worse, maybe 150 years of hidden in the making, because we solved it, right? We stopped slavery, and then we did the equal rights, and we hid it even more. So it's challenging.
And, you know, meeting with Black leaders is something that obviously should be done, but I forgot who mentioned that David marched with Martin Luther King, and I know Martin Luther King stayed at his father's house, but they did not listen to Huey. They didn't listen to Eldridge. They didn't listen to Stokely Carmichael or any of the people that were speaking, saying the things that they didn't want to hear. They listened to the Black leaders that said what they wanted to hear then, and they're doing the same thing now. And that has to stop.
Yeah.
We have to listen to everybody,
Sure.
especially the people that are the most disenfranchised.
That's right. It is much simpler to like a Martin Luther King than to like a Malcolm X.
That's for sure.
It's just easier. And so he's become the right person for us as white people to listen to. But by doing that, we sometimes close our ears to other voices that need to be heard.
And Malcolm spoke the truth, just like
Malcolm
Martin
spoke the truth. He did. Not an easy truth, because there's not just easy truths to be had right now. This issue is not full of easy truths or easy work. So here's the question. What work can we do that helps to let this conversation progress? How can we be involved in the conversation in some way or another? Not just us learning, but us in the community somehow being part of making sure this conversation increases.
I use my art to try to, express my concern about racism and my concern about what I have seen, like in particular with my Black friend, what I've seen him suffer, I think it's an important way. I think artists do have an opportunity there to confront. And people in a way that people don't quite expect and maybe sometimes are more willing to hear.
Yes, thank you. I love that in elementary education today, there are lots of books of color and just the regular books that that we're reading now have not just white children in them, right? That's one of the ways to have the conversation be there. Because when Judy was, during much of Judy's term as a teacher, and during almost all the time that I was there, most of the books were the types of books that had just white boys and girls, right? So we have better examples now. Art that is showing a diversity of. What else? Where can we be involved? What's happening right here in Tucson? Or what can we make happen?
Perhaps an alliance with a Black church?
Barbara Eisworth has already helped us to see some of that. And it's not quite a church that will help, but it's a good conversation, but it's an Ethiopian church, I believe. And so it's not quite people that are in the center of much of this, but at least it will do some of that conversation. But Iskashita is a really good example, I think, of what we have to do. What Iskashita does very strongly is say, we will be part of your community to these people who are coming from wherever they're coming from. And part of what we have to do in all this is say, you are part of our community as well. We have to be in relationship with. And the problem at St. Francis, and this is a built-in problem, is we sit up here on the castle walls of the foothills, right, with the Riito moat down below us. And it's real easy to hide behind those walls, isn't it? And
well,
we have to
come to the church.
What?
No buses come to the church.
I get that. So what's it mean that we have to intentionally and purposely try to do?
Well, years and years ago, we had a joint meeting with a Black Baptist church. Do you remember the name of that one, Liz?
It was over on the west side, beyond the interstate.
Like Trinity Evangelical Baptist Church or something like that.
Not quite, but that's close. Yeah.
It was on the
Elwood McDowell. Sorry.
From our church had joined that one, I think.
Yeah.
And so we worked with them on, we had a workshop on the death penalty, realizing that Blacks were much more subject to the death penalty than whites were. And that was a very interesting workshop. Plus, without telling David, a bunch of their guys showed up at the 9 o'clock service, and that was really interesting too.
I think it was Elwood McDowell's church. Okay. And we tried to do a number of things, but it was difficult. They were very far away. The logistics were tough, and it didn't click. It didn't work for whatever reason that was over time.
Sorry, Liz. I think mostly we invited them to come to us.
Yeah. I remember we did some walking down in their neighborhood.
Yeah.
I remember that.
Do you remember the name of the church, though?
Judy, do you remember?
No, I may have it somewhere in archives, but I don't know it off the top of my head.
So the question is how do we do that today, right? It doesn't have to just be with the Black community. It could be in any of the communities of color here in Tucson. And you don't have to go very far to get that. If you've driven down Grant Road and crossed Alvernon, you notice that the demographics change pretty quickly there. And can we forge relationship just those 3 miles between here and there? Not, like Wendy said, not expecting that a bus can bring them to us, but us choosing to be present there in some way or another.
The church that shared the space with the Baptist church on Country Club. They shared their space with a Black community for a long time. And we did go to their church and shared services with them. Do you remember that, Judy?
Not offhand, but
I'm not sure if they're still functioning or not, but we were really welcomed there.
And I'd venture to say that we have lots of different places where we could connect, but we are going to have to purposely and intentionally resurrect those connections. We're going to have to figure out how to go into spaces where it's going to be easier or more comfortable to not do, right? But to solve these issues, comfort is not going to help. We need to get out of comfort and expect uncomfort to happen.
Well, Jim, I know when I was in assisted living on Adams, like I was at Adams and Park. There's a black church right across from us, and I went there a couple times, and one of the few white people there, but their service went for like 2 hours.
They do. And are you willing to go longer than what you're used to?
But I was just, with my health issues and stuff, I was exhausted, but I mean, the music was, but it was very, very welcoming.
I think we'd also have to be really, really honest with ourselves about our reason for doing it.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, if we're just reaching out so that we can feel like we're doing something, I'm not sure that that's adequate.
Right. Yeah.
That almost smacks of that savior position.
That's right.
That's so abhorrent that they need white people in order to do what they want to do, and that's absolutely not true.
Thank you for pointing that out.
I think we have to be really, really clear with our own motivations before we, I mean, because I think we could call up all that white fragility stuff in an instant if we go in blazing saddles or something.
Yeah.
I think that we weren't clear in the past for any of these experiences. We wanted to have the experiences. We didn't know how to go about doing it, how to do it in an intentional way that was going to be the kind of loving, supportive, interactive, getting to know that we wanted to get to. Yeah. We didn't know how to get there. And it was just some of us randomly going, at least to some of these. We went to a number of different churches to experience other ways of doing church, and we just didn't do it very well, I think.
Elizabeth, did it feel somewhat like what a pastor friend talked to me about, where he was talking about his friend going down to feed the homeless, and it was kind of more, we went down to serve the homeless, not to relate to the homeless.
Right. There was some of that. But there was also some of, I want to go and find out, what is it that they're doing in these other churches? How do they see God? How do they see their relationship? What is the message? And to learn about other religions, if you will, but other ways of doing church.
Yeah.
So it was to educate ourselves.
Yeah.
With the one with Elwood McDowell, we really wanted to have interaction with them and do work with them, political work, PCIC work. We were really active at that in those days, and that was really the goal with that. And we did that for a while, and then it died.
One thing that I'm going back to one of our very early gatherings when Margaret asked, just sort of lamented that we didn't have any people of color who were joining this discussion, and just saying we do have people of color in our congregation. What can we do to connect more directly with them and make them feel more a part of who we are? I mean, that's an easy place to start, but I don't know that we really worked at that.
Right.
And also, I think to ask them how they feel as the minority in our church. If they really feel welcomed, or you know, just how they feel about all that. Because I think that being the only one there would be pretty difficult.
And do we listen to them, Margaret, right? And change. If they say, this doesn't work for me, or this would work for me, do we hear that?
Oh, and in White Fragility, don't they say that don't go up to a Black person and ask them those questions?
Well, but what she's talking about there is you don't want to just go in and point blank do that. You want to go in relationally. If we're just doing this as an academic exercise, if we're just doing this as was pointed out, to go and save them, right? To go do that savior complex thing, that's not what we want to have happen. We want to go in and relationally be changed by and be in a space of being with those folks.
Jim, when you first started, Vicki was part of the discussion.
Yeah, she was on vacation from work then, yes, and we interrogated her, wanting her to give us answers. It was really something.
Before we split, is she in the Tuesday discussion?
She's
at work at this hour now. She was on vacation those first 2 weeks.
She's at the 10:45 talk back time though.
Yeah.
On a regular basis.
But who went to her house to see the movie that she invited people to do?
Who did?
I didn't know she invited.
Good.
I hadn't heard about that.
Yeah, to see Hamilton.
Oh no, I didn't hear about that.
She did that at one of the talkbacks, and Judith went.
Oh.
Yeah, I did.
Thank you, Judith, for being there. But all of this, I mean, here's the good news. The other class periods, when we finished, it was kind of a, man, there's a lot in front of us. But with a little bit of a, and I'm not sure we can do it. How many have a little bit more uplifting of hearts, that there's good things in front of us? We have ideas, we have possibilities. That's what I'm hearing today, more than just the challenges. But what we have to do is be very intentional about finding those possibilities and coming back, bringing them back so that we can take advantage of them. So this week, look around you. Find the places where we can step into these roles that we've been talking about. Because, you know, we only have one more week to solve this whole issue.
Well, we got another book coming, yeah.
Yeah, we do have another book.
I'm wondering, I'm sorry, I'm wondering if PCIC might be a source for us.
Well, that's how I know Elwood, is through PCIC.
Oh, yeah.
I've met him there.
But there might be his church, or maybe he took flack for trying to work with us. I don't know the history there, but I'm also wondering if we might be better, not better, that's pejorative, that we might be wise to look at Black organizations other than churches. Because I think in church we tend to play nice.
Yeah.
I mean, we've been told to do that regardless of what our skin tone is. At church is where you behave yourself.
Yeah.
And from what I know of Black culture, you don't mess around in church, even if you're a little kid.
Yeah.
It's just not done. And so if we want real feedback, that may not be the easiest place to find it. I don't know.
So just keep looking around, seeing what else, what all we can do, what possibilities are there. And think about the Black community here in Tucson, but that's a pretty small sliver. Also think about the Hispanic community, which is not a small sliver of our community. And think about ways that we can move in both those arenas, right? And continue to enlarge our hearts in those ways. Let me stop for a second.